So I've been trying to print in some new materials, and I'm trying to achieve a very flat, matte looking finish on some of my parts. Now, in order to do that, I could print in a carbon fiber nylon based material, but for any of you who have printed in that material before, know that it requires a very high hot end temperature as well as a hardened steel nozzle, because the brass nozzles really don't like the abrasive material. And so the guys over at Digitmakers.ca suggested I try this PLA based material, and it's a D3D brand. If you haven't heard of D3D before, it's their in-house brand from Digitmakers.ca. So I'll put a link in the video description down below where you can find this stuff. But yeah, like I said, it's a PLA based material, so it should print as well or as easily as PLA. And this specifically is their matte finish filament. So it should give you a very nice flat looking finish on your parts. And so they sent over gray and olive for me to try out. So we'll go through these slicer settings for this material here, and we'll figure out the optimal settings that we can use to print parts nicely and reliably. And in the end, we'll actually compare them to some carbon fiber nylon based materials, and we'll see just how flat and matte the finish is on these parts. Before getting into the printing, one thing I want to mention here is the packaging of this D3D filament. So on the outside, it obviously shows you the color, and it also shows you the print settings for this particular filament. On the inside, the spool is packed very nicely, and it has the same sticker on the inside to identify the color and the print settings. And the other important thing to notice here is that it does have a reusable, resealable bag. So don't cut into it. You can reuse it and reseal the filament back up in that same bag. And so the first thing I'm gonna walk you guys through are the slicer settings. And so I'm using PE slicer. This is my slicer of choice. And I've imported this little planter pot model onto the print bed. And the first thing I wanna just mention here is that I'm using an ANET ET5X printer. And so if you guys aren't familiar with that, it's similar to the Creality machines. It's basically just a cheap Chinese printer. And I'm using this because it is one of my printers that has no modifications. So I just wanna show you guys that you can print this material on printers without any sort of modifications to the hot end or anything like that. It requires no special equipment. And so once I've imported the model in here, we can take a look at the print settings themselves. And so we'll just start off with the layers and perimeters. I'm starting with a 0.25 millimeter layer height, which isn't too crazy. Most people print at 0.2 to 0.3 millimeters. I find with this printer, 0.3 pushes its limits a little too much, so I dial it back to 0.25. It's a good starting point for you guys. The perimeters are at 3. Solid layers, top and bottom, are both at 3. In terms of the infill, I'm printing at 20%, and that should give us a strong and rigid part. Skirt and brim, not really important. Support material, if you need it for whatever model you're printing, you can enable it. Otherwise, for the model that I'm using, I don't need any. Speed is the important section. So perimeters, I'm printing at 40 millimeters per second. Now the external perimeter I have set to 85% of that 40 millimeters. And again, these are very conservative numbers. And the reason for that is that when speaking to the guys at Digitmakers about this specific filament, they had mentioned that the density of the filament is pretty high compared to regular PLA. And they said that some people experience hot end jams if they try and print too quickly with it. So I set the print speeds very conservative to start, and I found this works really well, and we'll see that later with some really nice prints. Now, if you guys are looking for more speed and you're impatient and you don't want to wait for your prints, then you can try bumping these up about 5 millimeters at a time, but I wouldn't suggest printing too fast with this material. I would suggest staying a little bit on the conservative side, just so you don't experience those hot end jams. Now the infill is at the same 40 millimeters per second, top and top solid at 25, bridges at 40, and the gaps at 20. The first layer speed at 25. So again, very conservative settings here, and it's a great starting point for you guys. In terms of the extrusion widths, first layer I have 125%, top solid 120%, and the infill, perimeter, and overlap at 35%, which I think is standard for the PE slicer. It might have been 25, I can't remember what the default setting is, but essentially I just don't ever really like having gaps between my infill and my perimeter, so 35% works really well for me. Moving on to the actual filament settings themselves, I'm starting off with a 1.75 millimeter diameter filament.
and I have no extrusion multipliers, just set at 1. I did not change the density as it doesn't actually have any sort of effect on the print itself. I think that just comes into the whole cost sort of thing. But anyways, temperatures 205 for the first layer, 200 for all subsequent layers. The bed is also at 50, and then subsequent layers are 45 degrees Celsius. So these are not exotic print temperatures. This is pretty much my standard go-to setup for PLA, whether it's just regular PLA or premium PLA. And now I found that it also works really well with this D3D matte PLA. So nothing crazy going on there. In terms of the cooling, I let the slicer determine what layers or what areas need to be cooled. I don't leave the fan always on for this filament, but when it is on, I have it set to 100%. The printer itself, like I said, is an ANET ET5X, just similar to the Creality machines. So you guys, if you're still actually setting up your machine, you can pause the screen right now and you can take a look at my settings and copy them, see if they work for you. Otherwise, specific to this print, it won't really be that important. With all of that exciting stuff out of the way, it's time to print. So I loaded up the first spool of the gray D3D matte filament, and I got started printing one of the many planter pot designs that I got off of Thingiverse. So on Thingiverse, I selected some geometric style designs. I wanted something modern looking, and I wanted some prints with some intricate details to really test out the filament and test out the printer too. And so a lot of these little planter pots have different facets like this one you see here. Some of them have intricate spiral sort of designs. And I don't have a fancy time-lapse setup, but I just basically took some short video clips of the various designs in their various stages of manufacture, and I've spliced them all together here in a compilation where you can see the filament being printed, and it's being printed on this ANET ET5X printer, as I had mentioned earlier in the video. And we'll take a closer look at all of these models when this little compilation video is done. Now, taking a look at these filaments under a better light, we can really see how it has such a low luster, low sheen to it. And the light is shining more or less directly on these parts. And like I said, you really don't see much of a sheen to them. The flat, matte look is excellent, and the parts printed with great detail. And so right there you can see how I'm pointing out that really distributed sheen line that you'd expect to see with a direct light hitting that object. And it really flattens out. So this is a really nice matte filament that you guys can use to achieve that look. And you're taking a first look at some of the olive green parts as well. So I didn't capture these in the manufacturing process, but you can see the finished product here, and it's a really nice color as well as the gray. But I find the olive green would work really well for military army style parts if you guys are looking to do something for, let's say, cosplay, where you can print off some nice olive drab green parts. I think that would work really, really well. In this case, I thought it would look nice as it's sort of an earthy tone, that I'm going to be using these parts as little planter pots for things like mini succulent cactus type plants. So the green works out really well for that too. Moving on to some of the more multifaceted parts here, you can really see how the transition of light from one face to another is really, really nice. There's not really that sharp sheen edge, and so it gives a really cool effect on these geometric modern little planter pots. And any other object that you'd print with a similar sort of design to it would come out looking great in my opinion. Even the layer lines are barely noticeable. I mean, I did print at the 0.25 millimeter layer height, so you'd think you'd see them a lot more. But one of the really interesting things about a flat matte finish is that you don't really see the layer lines as distinctly as you would with a higher shine PLA. And that's because, in my opinion, I think the sharp light reflection that you'd see off of a more glossy finish would be a lot more noticeable and bring out the smaller imperfections in the prints. And so now what we can do is take a look at one of these planter pots here and put it beside a regular black PLA print that I did. And so this is just in a standard PLA, and you can really see the difference here. And as I had mentioned earlier, you see that sharp sheen sort of finish. You can really see it on the bottom here, not really so much in the spiral pattern as the light gets broken up a little bit more, but it becomes very obvious the difference between the two. So this is a really, really flat matte finish. On the inside of the pots, I think it's even more obvious, and you can see the standard black PLA. There's that more of a continuous surface, so you can really see the higher shine. In contrast, on the matte PLA, you can see how the light really gets distributed, and you really don't see any sort of a distinct line in there. At the beginning of the video, I had also mentioned we'll do a direct comparison to some nylon carbon fiber parts, and you can see I've taken the olive green and put it beside the nylon carbon fiber part that I have here, and I would say that it's about on par with a nylon carbon fiber. So you get that amazing looking finish with the ease of printing of regular PLA.
And so that wraps up this video, guys. I hope that you found that information useful for printing with this D3D matte filament. And again, you can find this stuff on Digitmakers.ca. There is a link in the video description down below, so you can easily find it on their website. If you guys have any more questions about how to set up this filament, something I didn't cover, or something else you want to know, please put your comments in the comment section down below. I will do my best to get back to each and every one of you guys. Thanks for watching.